want to welcome you to the Dallas Independent School District STEM Environmental Education Center virtual field trip. We want to say a very special welcome to Thomas J. Rusk, Dallas Independent School District. Teachers, if you're watching and you're not signed up, please do so at this time. Go to www.tiny.cc/6-8 restoration and sign up, or please, we need to record your numbers. The program today will be adaptations of plants and animals. During this virtual field trip, students will explore organisms or their structures and use dichotomous keys for identification, explain variation within a population or species, and identify some changes in genetic traits that have occurred over several generations through natural selection and selective breeding. Mr. Ramirez will cover dichotomous keys. Mr. Dominguez, variations in populations, internal structures of organisms by Mr. Monroe, and natural selection and selective breeding by Ms. Schramm. Students, you cannot ask us a verbal question during this program, but you can go to www.tiny.cc/question-answer. Send in your questions. I do my best to answer them during the program. And if not, I'll send the answers to your teacher and they can discuss them with you. And now I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And Ms. Ramirez is going to tell you all about dichotomous keys.
Hello, my name is Ms. Ramirez, and in this segment, we're going to be learning how to use a dichotomous key. Now, before we do that, though, I do have an animal that I would like to show you guys. I'll give you some clues to who it is, and then I'll let you guys guess while I'm pulling it out. This animal has dry scales on its body. It is a vertebrate. It smells with its tongue. It is a carnivore. It is native to Africa. And it has excellent camouflage. So I'm going to go ahead and pull her out. You guys can be making your guess on who it is. And we'll actually be using a dichotomous key to help us identify the taxonomic class that this animal belongs to. So I'm not going to exactly tell you what that is. But this is Pelota. She is a ball python. And they get that name because, of course, when they're scared or threatened, they will curl into a tight ball. And you can see she's flicking out her tongue so that she can smell. We're going to be using a dichotomous key later to help us identify what taxonomic class she belongs to. So I'm going to go ahead and put our little animal friend up, and we'll start taking a closer look at what exactly a dichotomous key is. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you guys, and we'll get started with the presentation. So I do have a couple of essential questions for y'all. So hopefully by the end of this presentation, you'll be able to answer these two questions. The first is, what is the etymology of the word dichotomous? And the second is, you should be able to identify two careers in which a dichotomous key may be used. Now, I know dichotomous sounds like a big word, but you guys are probably already familiar with how to use one of these. I know when I was a kid growing up, we would read things like the Cosmo magazine. And so you might have seen little dichotomous keys very similar to something like this on the slide. Or if you've ever played the game 20 Questions, that is also very similar to how a dichotomous key works. So on our next slide, dichotomous simply is Greek. It means divided or cut into two parts. And a dichotomous key is simply used to identify an unknown organism. And we know that identifying organisms helps scientists understand an area's biodiversity and helps to document changes. So we know that dichotomous keys are useful for identification. Now, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, most people consider him the creator of the dichotomous key. He was a French naturalist, and he created the first text version of a dichotomous key for botany and microorganisms. So here at the top, you can see an example of the text version of the dichotomous key. Now, however, some people credit Richard Waller, he was an Englishman, they credit him with the first pictorial dichotomous key, and that was about 100 years before Lamarck. So here you can see Richard Waller's pictorial version of a dichotomous key here. So let's talk about how a dichotomous key works. So on this little video here, when I was in college, I studied entomology, and part of the projects that we had to do for one of our courses was we had to collect insects for a collection and we had to properly identify them. So we had to use things like dichotomous keys, field guides, and research to help us identify the insects that we caught. So all sorts of scientists, entomologists, biologists, zoologists, scientists use dichotomous keys to help them identify unknown organisms. So in this little video segment, we're going to be identifying an insect. It looks very similar to this insect that you see here on the left. And I actually zoomed in just a little bit on one. Here it is right here. So we're going to try and identify what order this insect belongs to. So the way a dichotomous key works, there are going to be two options. You always start at question number 1. So this dichotomous key is a text form. It either is going to have yes or no questions, either or questions, or go to prompts. Now, if we take a look really quickly at this example of a dichotomous key, we can see that it has 2 options and a go to prompt. So again, you always start at question 1. So let's look at question 1. Question 1 has 2 options, which makes sense. Remember, dicot means 2. So we start at question 1. The first option, 1A, says, does this insect have an extremely long prothorax or neck? Or the other option is, does the insect have a short or no prothorax? Remember, prothorax is just a neck. So if we look at this picture here of our organism, or if we look at our video, we can look at our organism and tell that our organism has a very short or no prothorax. So that is the option that we're going to choose. And if we go along the line, our command, it says go to question 3. So we're going to go to question 3. So question 3 has 2 more options. The first option is the wings are armor-like with membranous hind wings underneath, or the wings are not armor-like. So we'll see if our video will load again. We might be having some internet issues, but if we take a look at this picture right over here at the top, which best describes our organism? 3A or 3B? So hopefully you guys said 3A, because if you look at our organism here, the wings are armor-like, they're hard, and then there's the wings underneath. So that lets us know that we've identified our organism. It is a beetle that belongs to order Coleoptera. So with our dichotomous keys, you always start at question number 1. There's going to be 2 options. Choose the option that best describes your organism, and then continue to the indicated step. So that's the text form. Another form is the flow chart form. So remember that snake that I showed you guys earlier? We're going to try and see if we can use this dichotomous key to help us discover what class she belongs to. And we'll see if the video plays. But again, this is just pelota that you guys saw earlier. So again, we're going to start at number 1. We always start at the beginning. So we know that she's a vertebrate. Our next 2 options are, does this animal have fur or no fur? So hopefully you guys notice that this animal has no fur. So we'll go ahead and circle that option. Our next set of 2 options is, does this animal have feathers or no feathers? Hopefully you guys noticed that this animal does not have feathers. So we're going to circle that option. That will lead us to our next set of options. Does this animal have dry skin or moist skin? I know it's kind of hard for you guys because you guys aren't able to touch her, but because I was able to hold her, I know that she has dry skin. So once I'm at this point, it already gives me my answer. We know that Pelota, the ball python, belongs to class Reptilia. So no matter what form of dichotomous key you're using, you're always going to start at question number 1 or at the beginning of the flow chart. Again, you're just going to look at what your 2 options are. You're just going to choose the option that best describes your organism and then continue to the indicated steps. On our next slide, not only do scientists use dichotomous keys, but a whole bunch of other career choices. So we have auto mechanics, computer technicians, HVAC technicians. I know I was having car troubles last year and they were trying to figure out what was wrong with my engine. So they used something very similar to this to figure out that it was my turbo that was malfunctioning. Mechanics might use a dichotomous key, as you see here on the bottom, to help them identify different nuts and bolts. Something relevant to us nowadays is the medical field might use dichotomous keys to help them identify if someone has the flu, allergies, or COVID-19. So a variety of different career fields, not just scientists, but a lot of different careers utilize dichotomous keys in their careers and in their everyday life. So my challenge for you guys is to see if you can identify this plant that we have here. We have tons of this beautiful plant with those bright red berries out here. Take a moment to review, observe, and carefully examine this plant over here. Teachers, feel free to pause the video to allow students to observe and discuss the specimen that you see here. And think about how can you describe that plant specimen in terms of these categories that you see. So we have the nation, the shape, the leaf arrangement, the margin, and the arrangement on the stem. So you're going to have to really observe this organism. Then you guys are going to go to this website. It's the Trees of Texas Dichotomous Key online, and I'll show you guys what it looks like. It's from the Texas A&M Forest Service. You're going to go to the Trees of Texas Dichotomous Key online, and you're going to use this online dichotomous key to see if you can identify that pretty plant that I just showed you guys. So that's my challenge activity for you guys. That's all I have for y'all on dichotomous keys. I'm going to stop my screen share and give it back to Dr. Gorman to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Ramirez. And the student asked, what exactly is a dichotomous key used for? Dichotomous key is an important scientific tool used to identify different organisms based on organisms' observable traits. Dichotomous keys consist of a sense of statements with two choices in each step that will lead users to the correct identification. And remember, Ms. Ramirez covered it several times, always start with question 1. And now Mr. Dominguez is going to tell you about variations in population species.
Hey guys, it's Mr. Dominguez, and today we are talking about different adaptations and survival strategies that organisms use to survive times of very limited resources like water and food. What I'm showing you right now is a desert rose, and desert roses are native to the Saharan desert. So, like most plants that live in the desert, they are able to survive times of drought by being able to store water more efficiently than, let's say, a plant that lives in the tropics. They also have a very complex root system that allows them to absorb water, or the very little water that deserts get. So, this is one of the ways this particular plant survives in its environment. But we're also going to talk about some other organisms, some reptiles and some mammals, and we're going to talk about how they survive times of very limited resources. So let's get started. Did you guys know that reptiles go through a very similar process of hibernation called brumation? But brumation occurs for different reasons. When a mammal hibernates, it's because their food resources have become very scarce. So when it's winter, so when all those plants and bugs that they enjoy die off, some mammals will hibernate until temperatures get better, until food resources become more available. So animals like bears will hibernate, but reptiles brumate more because of temperature. Now, we know that reptiles are cold-blooded or ectothermic, so when temperatures are very low, their bodies will slow down. So their metabolism, their heart rate, their digestive system all will come to a halt during these cold temperatures. They will sleep off the winter until temperatures agree with their bodies. So, not because of resources, but because of the way their body functions. Little Teddy here actually doesn't brumate because he's a tropical turtle. Unlike some of his cousins we have, here at the center. Another wonderful type of animal that we usually don't associate with either hibernation or brumation are amphibians. And amphibians that are not native to tropical areas will actually burrow down deep into mud when temperatures become too low. So during winter, these guys will dig and stay dormant until temperatures become more agreeable. So here we have one of my favorite animals. He is a white tree frog. His name is Dumpy, and he is native to Australia. He can tolerate temperatures anywhere between 60 and 80 degrees, but when it does get colder, I will sometimes find him buried in his substrate. But I usually don't let the temperatures get too low, so he usually doesn't have to dig his way into dormancy. I'm trying to feed him right now, and I don't think he's too happy with me. And you might have seen one of his defense mechanisms, and that's peeing all over my hand when he feels threatened. So you might see it again. Let's see. He might not do it again. Well, oh, actually, there he goes. So he's got plenty of survival strategies. The white stray frog, another example of a animal that hibernates. Another way animals are able to survive those tough times of very limited resources and low temperatures is through migration. And we hear of birds migrating. And I know these chickens don't migrate, and that turkey certainly doesn't migrate. It doesn't have the ability to. Uh, but some birds will migrate down south to find the resources they need, not only for themselves, but to nest for their offspring. So these animals are too domesticated and live a very comfortable life here at the EEC, so they have no need to migrate. But migration is another way animals have adapted to their environment, or better said, to the lack of the resources available to them in their environment, so they can thrive and survive and reproduce. All right, guys, to recap what we've learned today, hibernation, migration, and brumation are all responses to a lack of resources due to a drop in temperature during the winter. Now, let's keep in mind that not all animals will have to go through brumation, hibernation, or migration to survive the winter months. Just like you and I don't hibernate, this goat doesn't hibernate. It's not a necessity for all animals. But I wanted to leave you guys with an interesting question that you guys can discuss in your classroom. Since we know that humans are having a drastic impact on global climate temperature, how is that going to affect the animals that do hibernate? So, since we know that there are environmental cues that animals use to know when to migrate, so that drop in temperature, what happens if the temperatures don't drop? Will animals cease to migrate? Will they cease to hibernate? How will animals cope with our environmental impact? So I'll leave it here, guys. I hope to see you guys next time in person. But for now, enjoy the rest of your day. I will see you guys next time.
Thank you, Mr. Dominguez. And the question came in, describe the variation. Variation among populations refers to the level of differences between two or more populations. If two populations were genetically the same, then there would be no variation among the populations. The more different the populations are from each other, the greater the level of variation amongst the populations. Thank you again, Mr. Dominguez. And now Mr. Monroe is going to talk about internal structures of organisms that have adaptations.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Mr. Monroe, and we're going to be looking at some internal structural adaptations that helps organisms, especially the organisms that I'm going to be using as examples today, survive or to meet their basic needs of life, okay? So when we talk about an adaptation, you know what? That's either a specialized structure or a function that allows an organism to survive by allowing it to get its basic needs to be met. Now, listen, guys. When we actually look at this, for example, I could take my big snapping turtle out of the aquarium back there and I use it to explain structural adaptations. And one of the things that students will recognize is the fact that he does have a shell that protects him. That is a structural adaptation, but that is external. Now, organisms do have internal structures that do act as adaptations that keep them alive. And I have several examples. And as I go through my presentation with you, yeah, somebody's getting a little jealous because they're not getting any attention. That's that old crazy bird over there. But listen, as I go through my presentation, to help you better understand, there's a couple of questions that I want you to ponder. As I go through the presentation, I'm going to be using a fish for an example. And I want you to be able to answer, why do fish have gills? And what do the gills do as they function to help that organism meet its basic need? Now, the other part that I want you to kind of focus on, it deals with plants. And it deals with xylem and phloem, okay? And I want you to be able to tell me what the function of the xylem is, and I want you to understand what phloem also means also, okay? So here we go. I'm going to start out by talking about the plant adaptations that I just mentioned. You know, when we talk about phloem or xylem, we're talking about parts of the vascular system of a plant. Now, the phloem actually, or xylem, actually is a reference, and I have a plant that I pulled from my old garden this morning before coming to work. And of course, I look at this plant. This is actually a collard green plant. I don't know how it has survived. They're pretty hardy. The big freezes or the little freezes that we had off and on. But actually the xylem part of this plant, the vascular part that we refer to as the xylem, we're looking at the roots here. These have very special tubes and tissue and made up of cells that have the responsibility for transporting water up through the stem of the plant. So that is the function of the xylem, okay? It is to transport water. And because it has certain cells that make up certain tissue that actually are specialized to move that water, it is part of the vascular system of this plant. Now we talk about phloem, we're actually talking about something in reverse. You know, plants go through a process called photosynthesis. And photosynthesis is the way that plants make their own food, right? They take in three main ingredients: sunlight, carbon dioxide out of the air, and they also take in a little water. And that process happens in the green part of the plant. So what's the green part of this plant? It is the leaves. Or the green part of most plants, it is the leaves. So that actually represents the area where the phloem is located. And that responsibility, it has vascular tubes in it, is to transport food and nutrients down through the stem of the plant. So they act in reverse. The xylem is transporting water up through the plant, and the phloem is transporting food and nutrients down the plant. Hopefully you've got a basic understanding of how the xylem and the phloem work for plant life, okay? Now the next organism that I want to discuss with you is something that is one of my favorite organisms. It's called a fish. And fish have gills for a specific reason. You know, I've got a fish here, and you can probably see him swimming around it. This is one of the last survivors of our pond. In fact, before our pond went dry, this little guy was collected from our pond. Let's see if I can get him out so you guys can get a real good look at him. This little guy, if I can hold him, is a baby or a young crappie, a fingerling, okay? It is a game fish in this state, very popular. Now, what happens to this little guy, this organism, if I keep it out of the water very long? It's going to die because it will die from the lack of oxygen. You see, fish have to use their gills to get oxygen. They don't breathe or take in oxygen like land animals or land organisms. Now, for that to happen, the gills are located, and I've got a skeleton here that I'm going to show you. The gills are located right in this area here. And water has to pass through the gills so that the gills are acting as a collecting agent, because in the gills, there are blood vessels. And as the water passes through the gills actually pull what we call dissolved oxygen from the water, and it enters the bloodstream of the fish and is circulated to the parts or the part of the body that the fish needs the oxygen. And so therefore, if that little fish had to stay out of water for a very long time, guess what? It would die, okay? Now, another good example, is birds. You know what? And I've got a bird back there. He's being real quiet, so I'm going to get him out and let you guys get a close-up look at him, and we'll talk about him for a little bit. Hang on. I'm on my way back with smoke. Guys, this is Smoke, and he is considered to be a bird, although he's a chicken. He's a part of the bird family. And as I got him out of his habitat a minute ago, man, was his wings flopping. It was almost like he was getting ready to take off. Now, this is considered to not be a bird that would fly, but birds have hollow bones, and that is a very special structure that allows them, to fly if necessary, or to move around and not use as much energy because they are lightweight. There he goes. I'm gonna let him walk around a little bit. He's kind of posing there for you guys, looking around. Come here. See, he's ready to fly. I'm gonna put him down, and I've got another little friend that I want to show you guys. Okay. Her name is Bessie. Bessie the Quail. Now, Bessie is a flying bird. This is Bessie the Quail. And if I put her down, she'll probably take off flying. And if you were to actually look at her skeletal structure, and you actually were to maybe dissect one of her bones or one of the bones from the skeleton, you would find that they are very, very hollow. They're unlike a lot of the other animal bones that would have maybe bone marrow in the middle of them. And that's because the bones are lightweight so that birds can fly. So that's an internal adaptation. Okay. And there we have that skeleton. The bones are very, very hollow, lightweight, so that the birds can fly. Now, we even have some internal adaptations for ourselves. The design of structures allows for a specific function to be completed. For example, within our body, our red blood cells are shaped so it allows that blood cell to squeeze through our blood vessels that allows that blood cell to travel all through our bodies. So there you have it. Hopefully you guys have got a better understanding about internal structural adaptations. Well, I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Gorman. And if you guys have any questions, I bet he can answer those for you. You guys have a good day today.
Thank you, Mr. Monroe. And we did have one question. A student wants another example of an internal adaptation. And we all know about this one, the ability of animals, especially bears, to hibernate. The internal organisms go through a change that allows the bear and other animals to hibernate, to exist throughout the winter when there's no food and all. The breathing slows down and everything slows down and allows them to wait till spring. And now Ms. Schramm is going to tell you about natural selection.
Good morning, everybody. It's me, Miss Schramm, and I'm sitting here with my hen, Bumblebee, and she is going to be a very important part of our lesson today because we are talking all about natural selection and selective breeding. So this is, like I said, Bumblebee, and she is a cream leg bar chicken. So cream leg bar chickens lay around 230 eggs per year, and their eggs are this really beautiful light blue color. Now, you just met Smokey, Mr. Monroe's chicken, and he is a rooster, but he is a silky chicken. So if we were having these two stand side by side, you would notice a ton of differences. The way they look, the color of their feathers, the texture of their feathers, their size. So different breeds of chicken have a lot of different traits. And some of those traits are chosen by nature and some are chosen by people. So I'm going to let her live her life a little bit. She's kind of weirded out that she's in the classroom, but we're going to talk some more about selective breeding and natural selection. So let me get this going. Thank you, Bumblebee. You're being a very good participant. This is her first field trip, so she's doing pretty good. Okay, let's see. All right, so at the end of my little section, you'll be able to identify some change in genetic traits that occur over several generations. And of course, I have these little chickens here because you can see all the different types of chicken breeds. There's so many. Okay, so here we go. Today's focus questions are, what is natural selection and what is selective breeding? Well, the first the first part is natural selection. So I'm going to read this brief definition and then kind of break it down for you. So natural selection is a process where organisms that are best suited to their environment survive and pass on their genetic traits in increasing number to successive generations. At the same time, organisms that are less adapted fail to survive or multiply at a lower rate and tend to be eliminated from the ecosystem. Harsh. So natural selection is just survival of the fittest, right? So animals that are able to adapt to their environment and are able to eat and get the resources that they need to survive will survive. They will produce offspring that are stronger, healthier, faster. And then the animals that are less likely to survive are less able to adapt, weaker or slower, or don't get the resources. They are less likely to reproduce. And eventually when they pass, those genes pass. So basically it's the stronger animals survive and keep making stronger offspring, right? So let's see some examples of that. So here we've got this little cartoon and we have some giraffes with long necks and giraffes with short necks. And of course we know that giraffes have to reach up into the tree and be able to eat the leaves, right? So if you're a shorter giraffe, you're going to get less leaves. You're not going to get the nutrition you need. Eventually, when that giraffe passes, it's not going to have more, right? It's not going to be healthy enough to reproduce. So the ones that will survive over time are the ones with the longer necks because they were able to adapt to their environment, right? So slowly over time, giraffes have longer necks because the giraffes with shorter necks did not reproduce and did not continue living. They didn't survive, right? So who came up with all of this? Charles Darwin was a naturalist He lived from 1809 to 1882. And he is a very, probably the most famous naturalist in history. He studied in the Galapagos Islands, and he studied a bunch of different animal species and noticed different changes amongst those species. So here is where he was in South America near Ecuador in the Galapagos Islands. So it's a little chain of islands, and the variations in the plant species amongst the islands led him to write his book called The Origin of the Species. So what we're going to focus on today is one of the aspects. There's 3 key aspects in his book, but we are just going to focus on the natural selection. So he started studying these finches. So there's plenty of other species, but we're just going to talk about the finches. So he studied these finches, and at one point there was a mainland finch. So a finch that was on Ecuador, right, on the land, that must have flown over and explored the island, right? So some of those finches from the mainland went to the islands. But he noticed that when he traveled from island to island, the finches were different. So each island, the finches changed. And the islands are spread out enough that maybe a finch could travel from one to the other. But over time, those different finches had families and looked a lot different until they were kind of different species. So depending on what they ate or what they looked like, that natural selection process kind of changed what those birds looked like, creating the different species. So depending on what they ate, so some of them were fruit eaters that he saw, and they would have certain kind of beaks. So if it was the island where their finches there were eating the fruit, they had different kind of beaks. If they were insect eaters, they looked a little different. So you can kind of see these over here. Then cactus eaters and the seed eaters, all their beaks looked different, right? But they all had the same common ancestor. So that's how he was able to come up with the theory of the species, right? How you create a new species of animal. All right. Next half is selective breeding. So that is the way that nature changes a species over time, but humans do that often as well. So selective breeding involves humans selecting animals and plants that have desired characteristics to produce offspring that will inherit those desirable characteristics. And also sometimes it is called artificial selection. So we've got natural selection and artificial selection. So this is where our little friend Bumblebee comes in, and Smokey, right? So if we want a chicken that is going to lay a lot of eggs, well, I already told you that cream leg bars, they lay 230 eggs a year. If you have a silky, like Mr. Monroe's chicken, Smokey, then they only lay about 100 eggs per year. So if you're a farmer and you want to sell your eggs, you're going to pick a chicken that lays a lot of eggs. So if you have a particular chicken on your farm that doesn't lay a lot of eggs, you're not going to want to let that hen near the rooster to reproduce. You're going to want to find the chickens that lay the most eggs every day, and you're going to want them to reproduce, right? So selective breeding is something that happens because of people choosing it to be that way. So here's my examples. So we can do selective breeding with plants and animals. So here we have an ancestral wolf. And now think about all the different dog breeds we have. So over time, people wanted dogs for different reasons. A lot of times before, it was working dogs. Some dogs needed to pull things. Some dogs needed to help hunt animals. Some dogs are meant to be companions, right? So all the different dog breeds have different purposes. So even though they come from a similar ancestor, we get different breeds over time because of how we chose to breed them. And that can be good and bad for species, depending on how selective things are. All right, but that's another day. So Then we also have what we can do with plants. So here's an ancestral plant, the Brassica, or I can't read it, plant. So an original Brassica. So this is a different plant family. So all of the ones that have the same ancestor are similar, but they're different. So now we have Brussels sprouts, cabbages, broccoli, cauliflower. So those plants were able to reproduce because people selected certain traits, and now we have different vegetables coming from those one plant. All right. So who came up with all of this? Robert Bakewell was an agriculturalist that lived from 1725 to 1795. And he was a farmer. And just like I said, he wanted to breed his animals to be the healthiest, the strongest, the biggest. Whatever he was searching for, he bred in his animals. So he bred sheeps with the most fur. He did cows, so they would have the most meat. And we still use those ideas of selective breeding today. So we have cattle out here at the Environmental Center. And even though we're not selling our cows or milking our cows, we have different types of cows kind of to show kids what we have. So different cows are bred for different reasons. So an Angus cow is raised for beef, and Holstein cows are raised for dairy. So depending on what type of product the farmer is trying to look for is the type of breed they're going to choose, right? So you can see, I wish you were out here live because the Angus cows are huge. When I first came here and saw how big they were, I was like shocked. But our other cows are big too. But when you compare them in real life, it's pretty cool. So there's an example of selective breeding in animals. Here's selective breeding in corn. So here is original corn, what corn used to look like long ago. And over time, you can see it changed to maize and other smaller corn varieties. And now you can see that big giant yellow sweet corn that we see at the grocery stores today. So that was all because of selective breeding. All right, so today's focus questions were, or I guess this is our kind of goal. So what's an example of natural selection? And name an example of selective breeding. So back to our little chicken. Let's see if she'll let me get her. Oh, she did, good girl. Okay, so with chicken breeds, is that an example of natural selection or selective breeding, right? All right, hopefully you have fun, and I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I can't wait to see you next time. Bye.
Thank you, Ms. Ram. And we have a question. Give an example of selective breeding here at the Environmental Center. And the Longhorn cattle, they have very nutritious beef, very little fat in it. So that means it doesn't taste too good. The fat is what gives you beef taste, but the Angus, they have marbling in their meat. They have a mixture of lean meat and fat in it, so it tastes good. So we crossed a Longhorn bull with an Angus cow, and we have a little black and white cow out there. And ironically, I did not know this, but the Angus did not have horns, and I knew that, but I did not know that it was dominant over the Longhorn. So the calf does not have horns, or she has little bitty tiny horns, not the big Longhorns. But if we were to put her in the freezer, the meat would be real nutritious and taste good also. So that would be our naturals, but we're not going to do that. Our little girl will stay here with us the rest of her life. Okay, and now I am going to share. Okay, the program today, Adaptations of Plants and Animals. During this virtual field trip, students examine organisms of their structures and use dichotomous keys for identification, explain variation within a population or species, identify some changes in genetic traits that have occurred over several generations through natural selection and selective breeding. Mr. Ramirez covered dichotomous keys, variation in populations by Mr. Dominguez, Mr. Monroe, internal structures of organisms, and Ms. Ram, natural selection and selective breeding. Thank you, teachers, for joining us. If you would, please go to www.tiny.cc/6-8 feedback, fill out a very short form and send it to us. We would certainly appreciate it. You guys have a great rest of the day, but more importantly, you have a great rest of your life.